let's get started then. So yes, indeed, my name is Aziz Burkhanov. I am an associate professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy. Primarily, my primary research interests are in the area of nationalism and national identity, nation building in Central Asia, Kazakhstan more specifically, and I've been looking a lot at the discourse analysis, how those issues, very important and very sensitive sometimes, are being portrayed in the public discourse, in the social media and print media, the traditional media, so to speak. And also, I guess, since I'm in the public policy school, I also look at sort of policy aspect of it, which is looking at the top-down approaches, what government is doing to promote a sense of national belonging, sense of belonging to a nationhood. And I think Kazakhstan, as well as other Central Asian countries, do offer a fair amount of, very interesting observations about how governments perceive what they can and what they need to do to strengthen, to promote this sentiment of belonging to a nationhood. And in this presentation, I will talk about perhaps three parts. We'll talk about very briefly about some overview of the Kazakhstan's nation building efforts. And I presume many people in the audience are somewhat familiar with the situation here, so I'll just outline some of the key developments in this area. Then we'll talk about media discourses, or discourses in plural, because I think there are very interesting dynamics in terms of how those issues are being portrayed in the media. And this is especially interesting because it allows us to kind of see where is societal reaction to the nation building effort. So we have the top-down a policy of promoting nation building, and then also we have the societal reactions. And then at the end, towards the end, I'll share some of the results of a survey that me and colleagues of mine have been doing a few years ago on the identity issues in Kazakhstan, and it aligns nicely with the ongoing population census, which hopefully will have results at some point soon. So we'll try to see what sort of dynamics are there as well. What is the perception of national identity issues, language policy, interethnic relationship in this country? So that's the outline. And when it comes to nation building, I think Kazakhstan has been, or Kazakhstan government rather, has been fairly proactive in promoting this vision of the country as some sort of a example of harmonious coexistence of various ethnic groups. And if we look at some of the government discourse, you may have seen this focus on interethnic stability, the fact that country avoided by and large major interethnic violence compared to what happened in the Balkans, for example. Government certainly takes credit. This, of course, does not mean that interethnic conflicts don't happen. Of course, there's a history of those. Sadly, last year in 2020, there were clashes in the southern part of the country. There were some others, but in general, sort of on a large scale, the government is promoting this vision of the country as an example of this harmonious coexistence. And we may see references to this number of 130, sometimes 140 ethnic groups living in peace in the country. There's also a very interesting institution in Kazakhstan called Assembly of People, which is kind of an umbrella agency for the so-called national cultural centers for major ethnic groups. They are given some state funding. They are given certain state support to offer some cultural courses, celebrations, festivities, and so on. Not only this, but also Assembly of People has a quota of 9 parliament members. So 9 MPs in this country are being elected through the quota for the Assembly of People. And the idea here is that they would those 9 parliament members, they would represent various ethnic groups. So it's not just an institution to oversee national, different ethnic groups, but also has a political sort of status. At the same time, there are some interesting, perhaps Soviet legacy sort of inspired elements in the domestic policies. For example, ethnic background is still being recorded in the domestically used ID cards. So on the backside of a Kazakhstani ID card, there is a graph called Nationalность or Ult in Kazakh, which represents this sort of ethnic background, and it is being recorded in the ID cards and census statistics. And of course, we can kind of project it to the Soviet legacy of the Пятая графа, or the 5th graph in the USSR paperwork, and many documents in the Soviet sort of paperwork. Usually the 5th graph was included, and there were important societal implications of this graph. At the same time, I think in Kazakhstan, we have seen several attempts to conceptualize, to reinvent the whole new understanding of identity. Those attempts have not been very systematic, perhaps. They were much more sporadic, much more inconsistent in some ways. But in general, we can also think about this campaign of promoting the whole idea of Kazakhstani nationhood, or Kazakhstani nation, Kazakhstanskaya natsiya, or Kazakhstan the Ult, as it is being portrayed in Russian in Kazakh. There were mixed reactions to this identity building campaign, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But just to again wrap up this overview. So Kazakhstan is interesting in a sense that it combines both sort of the Soviet legacy approaches, as well as some ideas about perhaps revising and reinventing, reconceptualizing national identity in this country. At the same time, there is a certain amount of challenges for Kazakhstani identity building, nation building process. Of course, first and foremost, and this is something that we will talk about quite a bit today. Of course, the conflict or different visions for identity. Of course, there is a Kazakhstani concept which embraces the entire population, sort of more or less irrespective of the ethnic background. At the same time, there is a fair amount of reference to ethnic understanding of identity, to very ethnocentric understanding of identity. And of course, there are other concepts, of course, related to the tribal affiliations. Of course, also a question of the coexistence of the two discourses, Kazakh and Russian, with somewhat different understandings and narratives about identity, language, history, belonging, authenticity, so to speak, to here. And in general, if we sort of look at those narratives, they do represent some rather conflicting views sometimes, because Kazakh language discourse in general implies that this notion of the state is ethnocentric, is Kazakh. It's a state, Kazakhstan is a state for Kazakhs, for Kazakh's ethnic culture, language, and so on, whereas Russian language discourse is a lot more embracive, a lot more inclusive, tries to present the country in a sort of more shared state. So we all live here by virtue of history, and we all share this land, and we all are part of this community. So those narratives are indeed quite conflicting, and I'll talk about them as how they are being represented in the media discourse. Also, for the language, perhaps it's worth mentioning, there are important linguistic developments in the country. Of course, Kazakh is the state language, is the only state language. At the same time, Russian has this officially recognized status in the constitution, which specifies that it can be officially used in the government institutions, and that's why there is a common misconception about that Russian is official language in Kazakhstan. Technically speaking, speaking, that's not actually the case. It can be officially used, but the official status is not conceptualized anywhere sort of legally, and that's why there is it creates some sort of an ambiguity. There were also a fair amount of programs for Kazakh language development, for Kazakh language sort of broader usage, with different degrees of success in general. And there's also the 50-50. Again, it's not exactly 50-50. It's a bit more complicated than that, but we'll talk about that. Quota usage in the media. So the idea is that the broadcast, the airtime should also be sort of divided between Kazakh and Russian, or state and sort of non-state language. So this is for the language. And also, I think in general, if we look at sort of de facto situation, Russian is still widely used in the country, although that varies across the country with some regional specifics, of course. South of the country is a lot more Kazakh speaking compared to the northern part of the country, for example. At the same time, fluency in Kazakh among Russians and other ethnic groups remains limited, although there are changes here as well. And of course, again, this is something that has been on the news lately. You may have heard about this linguistic patrols. So there's certainly some demand for stricter policies for coming from the sort of more Kazakh nationalist discourse, asking the government to be a bit more proactive in actually making Kazakh a real de facto state language. So there's a very complex picture here. And also we can say that in general, there is a fair amount of progress of Kazakh language use. So certainly is happening, and country is a lot more Kazakh speaking compared to, let's say, what was here 10, 15 years ago. So we do certainly see changes, but is that change due to sort of the policies that have been implemented here, or is it a bit more of a demographic changes, a reflection of demographic changes, bigger birth rates in ethnic Kazakh families compared to other? That remains a bit of a question, and I tend to think that this is more related to demographic changes that happened in this country in the last couple of decades. So that's, I guess, just an overview, and perhaps I will shift gears a little bit, and since we are a bit short in time, I'll talk about the media landscape in Kazakhstan, and I'll share some of the perhaps quotes from the articles that I've been collecting for more than 10 years at this point from Kazakh and Russian language print media in Kazakhstan. So if we look at, for example, just very briefly, perhaps I'll talk about the media discourse. So, for example, obviously in the Soviet time, the print media were well, they were playing a role of sort of presenting news in accordance with the party sort of guidance and the party line. And I think in here, of course, some of that legacy perhaps we see in today's Kazakhstan, where many newspapers are still, or newspapers and media outlets in general are much, I'll skip some of those just for the sake of timing, but I'll stop here. Many media outlets are somewhat not always profitable or sort of self-sufficient. In general, there is also this whole question of dependence on state sponsorship or state tenders, which also undermines sort of how critical newspapers can be. And I think in general, there is a fair amount of examples where newspapers, especially print newspapers, but I think for TV that applies as well, have been well reluctant to be critical about government policies simply because of perceived fear of losing the state funding. So in this case, in this regard, of course, there are some specifics in the Kazakhstan print and TV media. I think it's worth mentioning, of course, that regulations for media market in general, and Kazakhstan, Central Asia, former Soviet space in general, think about Russia, have become fairly restrictive. There is also a risk of judicial persecution. I think if you look at what is happening in certain former Soviet countries these days, I think that certainly confirms that. A question of censorship and also self-censorship, where journalists may not necessarily engage in some of the heated discussions for this this fear of persecution, I think, is also worth mentioning. So in general, there are some specifics about the media market in this country, in former Soviet space in general. But I would still argue, nonetheless, though, that media do offer a fairly interesting venue for looking at how vision or different visions for identity and nation building are being discussed. And for that purpose, I'll just make an overview of some of the media outlets that I've been studying again for quite a while. So on the left part of the screen, we have two major newspapers in Kazakh language: Yegemen Kazakhstan, so Independent Kazakhstan, and Just Alash, Young Alash. Alash referring to the this historical name of Kazakhs, and also the Alash government, perhaps, that existed shortly in the 1918, 1920. Казахстанская Правда and Время on the right. Those are the Russian-speaking, Russian language media in country. Kazakhstanskая Pravda is sort of the flagship state-backed newspaper. Время for a while was sort of most popular private newspaper. It is still now, now it is affiliated, technically speaking, with one of the financial groups, indirectly, again, affiliated with the state. So it's a little different now, but still for a while, it remained perhaps the sort of flagship private media outlet in the country. And I will perhaps share maybe a few quotes from different years, and this is a discussion that has been going on for quite a while. And I started looking at this, I guess, collections of articles since the beginning of since 1991, 1992. So I have a lot of articles. So I just picked, and again, you know, I can go on for this forever because I have this huge collection of pieces of articles. But I'll perhaps share maybe some of the quotes that are perhaps more illustrative of differences, of different understandings of identity and language issues. So, for example, this is, of course, a long time ago. This is from Kazakhstanskaya Pravda. An article was published in 1983, and at that point, of course, many things were still in this very transition sort of mode. And this article here says, all of us, Kazakhs, Russians, Ukrainian, Tatars, Germans, Koreans, we all live here. For us, the Republic of Kazakhstan is a homeland, and we are all, we are Kazakhstan, we see Kazakhstanцы, the paper says, we are all Kazakhstanis. And in general, this kind of discourse is typical for Russian language press, especially the government-backed press. They are a lot more sort of focusing on this narrative of being inclusive, of this inclusive country. So another piece, again, in Kazakhstanskaya Pravda in 2007, says traditions of friendship between peoples living in this country and narodi exist here for many centuries, and new generations also must accept that and cannot be otherwise. And we all of us here, we live in this land, so it's very important. At the same time, if we look at some of the Kazakh language papers, well, they may not necessarily share this notion of inclusiveness. And for Kazakh language press, it's a lot more common to portray the country as sort of a lot more, country of ethnic, Kazakhs. And I think if we look at the narrative, especially of Jasalash, but not only, at many other media outlets of Kazakhstan, we see quite different narrative. So here, this article in 2004 in Jasalash and private Kazakh language newspaper says, well, the builders of the state are Kazakhs, and the logic here is that we cannot build a state in any other place, and we should probably just give up on this laboratoria дружбы народов, this fancy term that was used in the Soviet times. So we just say, well, there's Kazakh people, and of course, people from other ethnic groups can become part of Kazakh people if they, are happy to embrace the Kazakhs, so to speak, and if they are happy to become Kazakhs, they can. But let's just say that there is only Kazakh people. Same here. This article again in Jasalash was dedicated to the numbers that were outlined in the census, the Statistics Bureau statistics of ethnicities. So this one is essentially challenging the government's discourse about 130 nationalities or ethnic groups living in peace. And this article says, well, if you look at the statistics, that doesn't really make sense, because if we look at statistics, there are only 6 ethnic groups in the country which exceed 1%. So we have Kazakhs, Russians, Uzbeks, Ukrainians, Uyghurs, Tatars, and Germans, and all other 124 ethnic groups, they all make less than 5% combined. So how valid this claim is it really 130 people living here? To what extent is really appropriate to say? So it's a lot more appropriate to say, well, there is one Kazakh nation and other 6 ethnicities. So this is essentially undermining the state narrative of this ethnic diversity here. Egemen Kazakhstan, this is a government-sponsored newspaper, flagship newspaper in Kazakh language, which says, and this is an article published in 2009, that says, well, whether we say Kazakhstani nation or Kazakhstani people, our goal is really to make the Kazakh state, or Kazakh Yele is the term that is consistently used in the Kazakh language discourse a lot more often, for example, than others. There is also, well, there are sometimes fairly regularly, in fact, publications in the Kazakh language press talking about this whole question of, all this sort of inspiration coming from abroad, from some sort of a conspiracy sort of argument. Oh, this idea was brought to us from other places. Why? So if we become Kazakhstani, if we become Kazakhstanci, then obviously we kind of lose the Kazakh language. Kazakh language will lose its attractiveness, its validity. It's no longer sort of part of the identity. And this kind of narrative is also fairly consistent in the Kazakh language papers with regards to Kazakhstanskaya natsiya, this Kazakhstani nation concept that has been promoted by the government in 2009, 2010. There was a fairly heated discussion of this. And in general, we can say, with caveats perhaps, that in general, the government has observed that this is indeed, there is a lot of resistance. There is some concerns about this in the Kazakh language press, and that's why perhaps we see a bit more sporadic approaches from the government. The government is not trying to push too hard with this, because obviously for a lot of people, this is fairly sensitive. Some other quotes about this is about language. So this is from 1994, so a long time ago, of course, and things have changed dramatically in terms of language instruction, the proportions. But back then, that was the situation. So here in this article, the paper, I think, is quoting a public official, says, well, in the education system, out of roughly 8,000 schools, half and half roughly are Russian, and Russian schools are actually more numerous than Kazakhs. Also, amongst university students, people who study in Russia, it's almost 80%. Is this really sort of, does it really give any room for any kind of claims for discrimination or anything like that? Of course, an important disclaimer has to be made. This was 1994. Now, of course, situation is very different, perhaps almost the opposite. The opposite, I think, most, if we look at the ENT, or its national test, or national university admission test, which is kind of SAT. And if we look at the statistics, more and more, almost 80% of people of high school graduates these days take it in Kazakh. It's only about 20-something% that take it in Russian. So the situation has changed dramatically here, and we'll discuss, I guess, in a moment why this may be happening, and I'll be happy to come back to that in the Q&A. So that's for language. At the same time, in the Kazakh language press, there is a fair amount of disappointment about how things are being developed with the language. So this is from Egemen Kazakhstan. It says, well, language law was adopted last year in 1997, and in the parliament, sure, there are some greetings, some ceremonial sort of greetings in Kazakh, but discussions are being held in Russian. And of course, things have changed a bit, but still, Kazakh language press consistently is criticizing this, saying, well, sure, they say a few words in Kazakh, just the opening, and then the core of discussion is in Russian. Here, this article is from 2001. Excuse me, from 2001. It's about the police paperwork. And again, this was 20 years ago. Situation has changed, of course, but back in the day, the paper was criticizing that the Interior Ministry, the police, basically uses Russian predominantly, and how we can explain the fact that Kazakhs are indeed most of the police force, and yet in very Kazakh language, Kazakh-speaking areas, all the police documentation is still in Russian. So how is that really even possible? Also, in some of the articles that Jasalash was publishing, there's a fair amount of heated criticism of the government, saying, well, you know, if you don't care about Kazakh language, then why are you there in the top level government positions? Perhaps we need to change, you know, governors, CEOs of banks, you know, top level government secretaries, ministries, ministers. So if you don't need the Kazakh language, this article says, well, we don't need you. And if you don't do anything for Kazakh language, then why are you there? Please go away, step down. We find somebody else who cares more about the language. That's the message. So there is again fairly different discourses in Kazakh and Russian language papers. Kazakhstanskaya Pravda also criticized this whole nation of translation. So the government at some point started to promote the paperwork being used in Kazakh, and yet at the same time, what happened, and this is happening still in some of the government agencies, is that there is translation. There is a staff on payroll who is in charge of translating the documents from Kazakh and Russian. So here the article says, well, you know, Kazakh courses are just formality, and also there is a fair amount of just translation. Just you know, so much of those documents are being just collected in folders and stored. Nobody really is using them. Kazakh language press also talks about this translation issue, and in this article they report, and it looks like this situation is not completely gone. It still is the case, at least in some of the agencies. So this article says, well, government HQ has 10, 15 translators. Most documents actually come in Russian, so they translate them in Kazakh. And do you really think that government actually cares about language? Probably not. So in every room there is a translator, in every corner there is another translator, and they essentially conclude the article saying, well, you know, Kazakhstan has turned into a nation of translators, you know, state of translators. That's the term, Kazakh term that they use. So state of translators, literally, that's what Kazakhstan sort of has turned into. So there is also, I will perhaps skip some of the slides, but I'll briefly mention the toponymics issue, because that's another fairly sensitive, because for many, there's those naive notions of renaming of cities, of streets, of geographical localities is also fairly important. So this is an article where Yegemen Kazakhstan reports about some of the kindergartens being renamed. So Dyumovочка, Svetlячок, Rodnichok, Счастливое детство are from now on called Bobek, Shamsharak, Akbulak. So close, but not exact, but fairly close translations of those names from Russian to Kazakh. So also there are street names, and many, well, 20 in this case, streets were renamed in the name of Sankaiha, Ahatai Batar, Dospambedjerau. So those prominent figures of Kazakh history. Some of those figures are sort of more mythical figures. It's from, you know, epic poems rather than personalities. But in here, again, this notion of renaming, this is being represented with a sense of pride. So, you know, we really need to change to get rid of these names. In Jasalash reports about Petropavlovsk, city in the northern part of the country, close to Russia. And this paper says, well, you know, this article says, well, you know, Petropavlovsk doesn't really look like a Kazakh city. It looks like a Russian city, because there is Lenin, there is Krupskaya, Kirov, communism, all those street names are still there. And this land is Kazakh. So maybe it's time to, you know, actually do something about it. So there is also, of course, perhaps most most famous case of renaming was Almaty, renaming the biggest city in the country from Alma-Ata, the name that was used in the Soviet time in Russian, to Almaty. And here Kazakhstanskaya Pravda says, well, maybe we did it, that was a little too harsh. Maybe it sends kind of the wrong message. Why did we actually need to rename Alma-Ata? Because it was still beautiful, melodious Kazakh name. Perhaps we did it wrong. So that's the message. At the same time, if you look at Kazakh language press, they say, well, not really, no. Alma-Ata is Kazakh's name, they say, but so why are Kazakhs unhappy? But no, Alma-Ata, from grammar perspective, is not actually a Kazakh name. It does not meet any of the Kazakh grammar or language rules. It has no meaning whatsoever, as some people argue, and that's why Almaty is a lot more appropriate name for this. This in this article, they of course talk about the whole question of. So, people are nostalgic about Alma-Ata. They are nostalgic about the old times where Kazakh language was kind of, not used much. So they are nostalgic about those times. And now they are unhappy because, well, they ended up in a very different kind of situation. So again, I can go on for a while with the papers. I have a huge collection. Maybe perhaps I'll very briefly show a few, some of the cartoons, because those are also quite interesting. This is cartoon in Jasalash. So the entire article, the title, which is kind of, we can't really see the rest of it, it says, Memleket Minsin Beaten Minister. So a minister who does not respect, does not care for the state language. And here, this person here is Natalia Korzhova. She was a finance minister back then in late 90s. And she is comfortably sort of sitting in the chair with her feet on the book called Kazakh language. And she is kind of arrogantly, keeping people away. So please don't call me, don't come to me. And again, this kind of narrative was also quite popular back then. It still is, in fact, in some of the papers. Another one, this one refers to the quota, the 50-50 quota in the television broadcast. And basically, when this quota was introduced about 20 years ago, and the situation now is very different. But back then, when it was introduced, what happened is that a lot of Kazakh language broadcasts, just to formally comply with the requirements, Kazakh language broadcast was put late at night. So all the primetime TV was in Russian, and all the all the sort of non-primetime TV was in Kazakh. And here on this one, on this cartoon, we see a group of Kazakhs who gathered to watch some TV. But because it's so late at night, everybody is essentially falling asleep. So here, the daytime TV, televidение is in Russian, and TD, which is teledidar, TV in Kazakh, is at night time. And some of the media outlets back then were making kind of sarcastic comments that Kazakhs will turn into a nation of late night TV watchers, so Natsiya Polnochnikov, just because the only time Kazakhs can actually watch TV in Kazakh is past midnight. So there is this, this was quite popular. Situation has changed since then, of course. A lot more better quality content is available in Kazakh, and in general, situation is of course quite different. But back then, in the early 2000s, that was a fairly heated discussion. Another one, this is about language, employing the hospitality argument, which can also be seen in some of the Western European societies, perhaps about the immigration issue. But in general, this refers here to the whole question of sort of how Russian language came to Kazakhstan. So it says here, Kazakh language, Kazakh tele, so means long time ago, everything was great, and Kazakhs lived happily, playing dombras, sitting by the yurt. Then what happens, keshe, so keshe means yesterday. So yesterday what happened is that we have a Russian language coming to the to yurt, and Kazakh language is politely inviting them in. And what happens, bugun, so today means Russian language is comfortably installed inside the yurt, and Kazakhs, or Kazakh language in this case, is not even allowed to be inside. So this kind of argument is also, I guess, as I said, similar to this whole hospitality argument that that we can see in some other societies as well. But this is something that we again can relate to, not just in Kazakhstan, but in some other societies. So just maybe since we're short on time, I'll be a couple of more minutes and I will finish. But before, I would like to maybe show some of the results of a survey that me and my colleagues, Dr. Dina Sharipova from Nazarbayev University, from GSPP, were doing a few years ago. This was in 2016. It's time to update it, but I guess just I would like to maybe share some of those results. So we looked at the perceptions, or societal perceptions of some of the national identity issues in the country back in 2016. So here we asked the question, so what is the sort of more suitable to you? What do you think is better describing someone living in Kazakhstan? Is it Kazakhstani or Kazakh? And here, as we can see, a lot more people tend to be sort of more pro-Kazakhstani rather than Kazakh. So some sort of more of a civic understanding to some extent seems to be prevailing. And if we compare that with earlier studies that have been done by other colleagues, I think in general, it looks like the whole civicness is certainly getting more endorsement compared to, let's say, earlier studies. And then we asked the question, well, what does it mean to be Kazakhstani in this case? Is it to be a citizen? Is it to be born? Is it to be born in Kazakhstan? That is it to live in Kazakhstan most of life, or speak Kazakh, or be a Muslim? So, and in general, again, as we can see here, most people somewhat preferred, to highlight the citizenship. Although for quite a lot of people, being born in Kazakhstan was also an important marker. So if you look at rather significant, we are talking about 80+% here. Religion or even language were somewhat less, although language was getting some significance, but religion certainly wasn't. So Muslim identity, despite some claims in scholarship in general, seems to be much less relevant. But language certainly is. Then we asked, and I'm wrapping up here, language is important, but we also asked this whole question about visuality. So which symbol you think would better represent Kazakhstan and kind of can be considered as sort of a brand or symbol of sorts of Kazakhstan? And we included both sort of more ethnically charged kind of symbols, such as ornamentation, for example, or dombra. And we also picked or included some neutral-ish symbols, such as tulip, snow leopard, golden man, this costume of a Sak tribal prince discovered in Almaty in 1970s. So those are results, and again, the golden man, this figure scored highest. Although people were also picking the Bayterek, this tower in downtown Nur-Sultan, the Dombra, the Yurta. So in general, again, in terms of this proportion of ethnic versus non-ethnic symbols, in general, it looks like ethnic symbols may not have the utmost priority. Dombra, Yurta, sure, but still, if we look at the numbers, this is a little different. And just to wrap up, maybe a couple more slides. So we asked the fluency in terms of language, and in general, again, the linguistic situation is indeed changing. So people may consider, a lot of people consider Kazakh as their mother tongue. At the same time, in terms of actual proficiency, that's the numbers are somewhat different. And Russian language remains fairly widely spread in Kazakhstan. Then we asked, maybe skip some of those. We asked, some questions that some people might find somewhat provocative, perhaps, but it was interesting to see what people think. So we asked the question, so I'd rather be a citizen of Kazakhstan than any other country. And also, interestingly enough, there is a fair amount of people who endorsed that statement. Also, we asked another question that is, again, somewhat provocative, perhaps. People must support the country even if it's doing something wrong. And also interesting that 70+% kind of endorsed that statement and said, well, sure, this no sort of unilateral kind of support. Okay, well, and also final slide here, that I show, and we'll also ask a few sort of more practical questions. So, are you, sort of this patriotic sentiment? Are you ready to actually pay more for something that actually has been made in Kazakhstan? And turns out as well, not a lot of people are actually willing to make this financial commitment to pay more for something that is made in Kazakhstan. We also asked, is there any preference to actually buy stuff that was produced locally? And again, some support, but not so much of a unilateral kind of support. So I'll stop here. Sorry for taking a bit more time than it was supposed to be. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you very much for your attention, and we're happy to discuss. Thank you.